Yep.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Chris Faulkner with the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies. I'm here with Mrs. Amberin Zaman, a journalist with Al Monitor, previous Turkish correspondent with The Economist for 17 years, has contributed to the LA Times. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Kurdish question, and I'd like to start off by asking maybe how you got started with the Kurdish question and covering this region of the world, why journalism, and given the recent political climate and struggles of the Kurdish question, you can maybe talk a little bit about your experience in the region.
Well, first of all, I happen to come from the one country that has more Kurds than any other in the region, and that's Turkey. People say that Istanbul is the world's largest Kurdish city. And so how did I get into journalism? Well, accidentally, as many journalists did, but I discovered that Kurds very quickly, having done so as I was sitting in my office in New York, Manhattan, working for Business Week, covering Wall Street, and when I saw the images of all these poor Kurds stuck on the mountains of Iran and Iraq as they fled Saddam Hussein in 1991 after their failed uprising against him, I thought, my goodness, why am I here in Manhattan? I should be there covering this. And that's really what drove my interest most immediately, but also my background, partly because I'm half Bangladeshi, and in Bangladesh too, we have a similar background of Bengalis being discriminated against by Pakistan, because Bangladesh used to be part of it, and then as a result, the liberation movement beginning and concluding with the establishment of Bangladesh, but Bangladesh had India and Russia on its side, so that made it much easier for it to become independent.
Great, thank you so much. So you have kind of a unique experience, maybe coming from the West, and one of the few individuals and journalists who was on the ground in Iraqi Kurdistan during the independence referendum. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about what the atmosphere was like during the referendum and then in the immediate aftermath.
Well, it was an incredible explosion of joy, celebration among the Iraqi Kurds, because this is what they've been aspiring for, for decades, and they've shed their blood for this. The Iraqi Kurds have struggled for decades against very cruel governments in Baghdad, as you know. They faced an annihilation campaign with over 100,000 Kurds killed in what was called the Anfal campaign. And then you have, of course, a very horrible tragedy in Halabja in 1988 when Saddam Hussein rained chemical bombs on the local population there. And so, this was seen as the culmination of all these years of suffering and struggle. And so there was a lot of festivity, joy, energy. People seemed incredibly happy that, as they saw it, their leaders were finally going for it, taking this huge step towards independence.
Do you think the Kurdish leadership could pursue or should have pursued a different strategy to maybe avoid the current situation with the territorial losses that have resulted from the referendum?
Well, it's always easy to, say those kinds of things in hindsight, what people could have done differently, etc. First of all, we need to understand why Masoud Barzani, the president, or the former president, he was forced to step down, thought this was the right moment. Well, there are several reasons for that. First of all, in his mind, he believed that the Turkish government was on his side. Even though the Turkish government was saying the opposite, he felt that, President Erdogan, unlike previous Turkish leaders, seemed much more accommodating of the Kurds, Iraqi Kurds' nationalist aspirations. He had signed this mega energy deal with Turkey in 2013. He was allowed to export his oil independently of Baghdad thanks to the Turkish government. All of these seemed to send him a very strong signal that Turkey would be okay with it, plus he was allied with Turkey against the PKK, this other Kurdish militia that has been fighting the Turkish state for the past 33 years. So he thought he had that box ticked. Well, because of this whole fight with ISIS, etc., the Baghdad central government was very weak. Plus, because of ISIS and the Iraqi forces pulling back in face of their advance, the Iraqi Kurds were allowed to capture Kirkuk, which is where a lot of the oil is, and other so-called disputed territories. So they basically, had everything they needed for this Kurdish state to be sustainable, or so he thought, and that if he waited any later, the whole situation could be reversed. So he thought this is the time to, strike the iron while it's still hot, but obviously there were many miscalculations. I think he did not appreciate the extent to which the United States actually meant it when it said it was opposed to this referendum. I think he calculated that at the end the United States would always side with the Kurds, particularly given this administration's hostility towards Iran, because in his mind the Kurds are the best countervailing force against Iran or within that region rather than Baghdad and the government there. He also underestimated the disunity among the Kurds themselves, because it was partly thanks to another group of Kurdish political leaders allied with the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan that actually cooperated with Baghdad, allowing them to come back and take Kirkuk, etc. So yes, there were quite a few miscalculations there.
So you've actually kind of hinted at my next question, which is why do you think the U.S. administration did not support the Kurdish bid for independence? And do you think this is something that's unique to the current administration and may have been different under the previous administration? And do you see it evolving differently, or is this the Iranian question something that's constraining U.S. behavior?
I think it's actually always been the U.S. policy, the one Iraq policy, keeping Iraq intact. I think when the United States occupied Iraq, it did have a chance, to let the Kurds go their own way. They could have allowed that to happen, but they didn't actually encourage that. On the contrary, they encouraged cooperation between the Kurds and Baghdad. And so, no, this is not a new policy. And if you look at history, you'll see that it's repeated itself time and again, with the Kurds believing somehow that the Americans would be for them, and then the Americans sort of pulling the plug. This happened in 1975 when the United States was secretly arming the Kurds against Saddam Hussein and working together with the Shah of Iran. So the Kurds, Iran, were the allies against Baghdad. But then when the Shah of Iran and Saddam Hussein did a deal, the Americans pulled the plug on them, and that's when Saddam unleashed this horrible campaign, as I described it, of annihilation of the Kurds. Then more recently in 1991, when you had the Gulf War and President Bush seeming to encourage the Kurds and the Shia to rise up against the central government, and they did, only to have the United States do nothing when Saddam came back and attacked them again. And now today you have this situation where they held their referendum, and in the aftermath, the Iraqi security forces moved onto Kirkuk and the other disputed territories, and the United States basically, stood by and watched. And in the Kurdish mind, that was yet another betrayal. So it's very clear that the United States is not going to actively support Iraqi Kurdish independence, and in this instance, you could even argue that they actively discouraged and indeed acted to prevent it.
That's a really helpful clarification, kind of about the history of U.S. policy towards the Kurdish region.
Well, I think they believe that it's in the interest of regional stability to keep these countries intact, for better or for worse. Whether it's a winning strategy or realistic is another matter, but they, seem to be more acting on more of a ad hoc basis, trying to, save the day, put a big band-aid over things and sort of muddling through, and all along sticking to this notion that these countries have to stay together because, the disruptions as they see it that this would cause are too great and are not serving U.S. interests, because countries like Turkey, for instance, a U.S. ally, at least in name, is violently opposed to Kurdish independence, it seems now, because they fear that this would trigger independence movement at home, because as I said previously, there are more Kurds in Turkey than anywhere else. But then this begs the question of why then Turkey allowed the Iraqi Kurds to export their oil, do all this stuff that seemed to signal that they were okay with an Iraqi Kurdish state. Well, this is because when they were doing that, you didn't have Syria sort of in chaos. But after the uprising in Syria, when the pro-PKK, therefore anti-Turkish Kurds, won control over the Syrian territory bordering Turkey, this freaked Turkey out, because then they sort of looked at the map and saw an uninterrupted zone of Kurdish influence all the way from the Iranian border, incorporating the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds, and thought, oh my God, no, this has gone too far. And so that's when Turkey did what you could call a U-turn on its Iraqi Kurdish policy as well, and went back to its former policy of total containment of Iraqi Kurdish nationalist aspirations across the board everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex situation, and that kind of leads into my next question regarding the Syrian Kurds and specifically U.S. support of the PYD and the YPG, the People Defense Units. Do you think the referendum has influenced their calculations about longevity of U.S. support and what their ultimate ambitions are, given the defeat of ISIS or the downsizing of ISIS's strength in Syria?
It's absolutely not gone unnoticed what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan. I think it was quite something of a wake-up call for the Syrian Kurds. They saw that, when push came to shove, the United States and all the regional actors were completely opposed to Kurdish independence, even in Iraq. And I say even in Iraq because the Iraqi Kurds were, of all the Kurds, the closest partners of the United States. And you had President Barzani, received by U.S. presidents at the White House. So he had sort of global legitimacy that none of the other Kurdish leaders have. And certainly the PKK, which is the guiding, the most influential force at the end of the day in Syrian Kurdistan as well. The YPG, PYD, however much they deny it, are very much part of that organization. And they do acknowledge that Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader, who's now in a Turkish jail, is their leader. That group is on the U.S. State Department's list of terrorist organizations, so it seems even less likely that having, sort of let down, let's say, to put it politely, the Iraqi Kurds with whom, they have formal relations, that they would, put themselves out for the Syrian Kurds and help them sort of build something similar to what the Iraqi Kurds have or had in Iraq. It's more of a transactional relationship, and the United States has said all along that its goal is to defeat the Islamic State, not to overthrow the government in Damascus. So I think that has to be borne in mind by the Syrian Kurds when they make their calculations about the future and the longevity, as you put it, of that relationship with the United States. So their game plan is to milk it the best they can, gain the maximum benefit from it, and use it to sort of leverage their relationship with the central government and extract the maximum concessions they can while the United States is still in the picture and they're still relatively strong. But that will be far more difficult to achieve once the United States leave. So, that General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, recently said that the United States would stick around until there was a negotiated solution in place in Syria. But can we take him at his word? I don't know. Other stuff could happen along the way. If US troops came under attack, for instance, in Syria, would the United States be willing to sort of stay the course? I'm not so sure.
So moving into some additional questions regarding the PYD, and specifically its alliance with the SDF we've seen they've increasingly gained control of ISIS-controlled territories within the region that are primarily home to Sunni Arabs. And I know that you're fresh off of trips to this region. Can you maybe talk about how locals feel about the new arrangement between the PYD and SDF alliance? And do you get any sense about tensions between locals and the newly occupying forces? Are they welcoming to a new entity outside of
As
ISIS?
they've moved beyond the Kurdish majority areas towards places like Raqqa, now Deir Zor, which are heavily Arab populated, of course, as the United States helped build up this force that you mentioned, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, it's still very much Kurdish-led, I'd say, because these are the guys with the expertise, with the experience. They've been fighting Turkey for 33 years. These people understand war, but they've tried to add more and more Arabs as they moved into the mainly Arab territories, precisely because they don't want these people to seem like an occupying force, but rather a liberating force. And of course, I think it's way too early to assess to what extent, this cooperation that we're now seeing between some Arab tribes and the Kurds, the YPG, against ISIS can sort of morph into something more long-lasting that can be institutionalized. I think for now they certainly have a common cause, which is to get rid of ISIS, this very brutal militia. But moving beyond that, as they then negotiate their future with Damascus, as they will have to, because nobody is willing to overthrow that regime or to, back those who want to with any meaningful force. They haven't all for the past 5 years. No reason to expect them to do so from here on, and especially given that Russia seems so determined to keep the regime in place. Then what happens? I think, the Kurds will be sort of batting for themselves, the Arab tribes for themselves. Everybody will be looking out for themselves rather than, as one would hope, for the common interest. I mean, that's a typical pattern that one observes in the Middle East in the aftermath of these conflicts, as we saw, for instance, in Iraq, when, the Shia and the Kurds and some Sunnis banded together with the help, obviously, of the Americans for US intervention. I don't think Saddam could have been toppled. But once they achieved that, then the old, divisions, differences re-emerged. So it's I think way too early to sort of paint a rosy picture of Arab-Kurdish cooperation in Syria.
Okay. So thinking about, and you're alluding to it now, kind of into my next question, is the future ambitions of the PYD within Syria, given the failure of the referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, and questions about U.S. support of the YPG moving forward. We know that there's been, as you mentioned, some assistance from the PKK, and how closely these organizations are entwined with one another. What do you see the PYD's ambitions looking like, moving from present to sometime in the future?
Well, they have said very clearly that they don't want an independent state, and if they did, well, it's very clear that they would be very hard-pressed to get one if you look at the map. First of all, they're not homogenous, the Kurds in northern Syria. They're truncated by pockets, or more than pockets, of Arabs, actually real town cities that sort of divide them up. So, it's not homogenous. And one of the main Kurdish enclaves, Afrin, is something that they've been trying to link up with the rest of their territories, and they failed. Turks saw to it that didn't happen, and the United States did not support them in that. As I said, they'll try and leverage the US partnership as much as they can to extract maximum concessions from the central government. What do they want? They would ideally want to maintain the status quo, where they're pretty much running their own affairs in the way they choose. But I don't think that in the medium to long term that the central government in Damascus, and they've said as much, would be willing to just, allow them to continue doing that. I think that the regime will want to reassert control over those territories. It will want to reinsert its troops along the border in much in the same way that Iraq now says it wants to in the Kurdish parts of Iraq, reestablish control over its borders. And, they may decide to do that by force if the Kurds resist. And it's not clear to me that the United States would rush to their rescue if that were to happen. I think the more likely guarantors of Kurdish security in Syria are the Russians, because the Russians see them as a very useful lever against the regime, as a pressure point. They can use the Kurds to sort of squeeze Damascus into more accommodating behavior in terms of Russian interests. Equally, they can leverage the Kurds against Turkey, to use them to contain Turkey, the Russians. So I think they will be certainly better off than they were previous to the uprising, but I don't believe that they will have as much freedom as they currently enjoy. But, this is Syria. You can make these predictions and then something completely different could happen. We shall have to see. And there's always the Iran factor. And if indeed this government decides to, the administration here decides to repurpose the SDF as an anti-Iranian force of some kind, using them against Hezbollah or, the Shia militias in Iraq, then of course we'll have an entirely different situation, a much more volatile one, I would argue, and not necessarily one that would serve the interests of the Kurds in the long run, because they have to continue to live with Iran, with Turkey, with Iraq, with Syrians.
Yeah, thank you for the candidness of the answer. I think this does a really good job of kind of painting the picture for maybe how regimes might reel back in these autonomous regions, post-conflict environments, especially given Syria, and how minority groups within these conflicts might have future aspirations that greatly exceed what the regime is willing to tolerate. So maybe zooming back out from just the Syrian question, and maybe one last overview or series of questions here is kind of how do you evaluate the prospects for the Kurdish people in the 4 Middle Eastern countries in which they reside? Because I know we spoke at length earlier on different degrees of assimilation depending upon where the Kurdish population is located. And so can maybe talk about what their prospects look like within each of the 4 countries.
Well, oddly enough, I would say their prospects within Iraq still look the brightest. You still have a constitution in place that gives them significant rights. They do still, for better or for worse, run their own affairs, though I think their room for maneuver is shrinking, and now that, the ISIS threat is beginning to subside, the central government in Iraq will have more time to focus on reasserting its authority in those regions. But nobody talks about the Sunnis, and I think, if the Sunnis and the Kurds ally, they could possibly exert enough pressure on the Shia in Iraq to, be more accommodating, to stick to the spirit of the constitution, and maybe even improve it in ways that make for more harmonious cohabitation among all these groups. And of course the United States has a very important role in terms of enforcing that dialogue. The United States still remains a very important partner for Iraq. Without the United States support, ISIS could have overrun Baghdad. But we also have to recognize that Iran is a very important player in the region, and that no government in Baghdad can have hostile relations with Tehran without imperiling its own existence. So they do need to maintain that balance. And I think Turkey continues to have a role that it can exercise in Iraqi affairs through the Sunnis and through the Kurds. But coming to Turkey itself, in the immediate term, I think that things will not be great for the Kurds, because the president has deemed it in his interest to sort of side with the nationalists in Turkey, co-opt the nationalist base, and build that. And that often translates into anti-Kurdish policies, rolling back all the reforms that he himself initiated in favor of the Kurds. That will continue for some time, certainly until these elections that are scheduled for 2019, municipal, presidential, and parliamentary. But, as you say, zooming out, looking at the broader picture, compared to where they were a decade ago, the Kurds are in a far better place. With the exception of Iran, I'd say, in all of these countries, they've made advances, and you're not going to put that Kurdish genie back in the bottle. Moving forward, any government in all of those countries is inevitably going to have to deal with this question and find a way of cohabiting with the Kurds. Otherwise, this conflict, they will continue to be a factor of instability and conflict. And this, of course, brings down the whole country. Turkey spends billions of dollars, on this, fighting this insurgency. Makes so much more sense, as it did for a while, to engage politically with these people and address their grievances, through democratic reforms rather than through military tactics. They have failed, and they will continue to fail. And the same, I think, applies to all these countries. And if the Kurds in Iraq wanted to be independent, it's not an accident. They were treated horribly, horribly. They just don't want to be part of Iraq anymore. And I think countries like Turkey, Iran, and, whoever's governing Damascus needs to draw a lesson from that and realize that if, they don't give their Kurds a fair deal, they won't want to be part of their country anymore.
Great.
Either.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I believe that's all the questions I have for you.
Okay.
But on behalf of the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd program and UCF more generally, we'd like to thank Ms. Zaman for coming in
Thank you
and
for having me.
participating.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.